Covenant Prime did not resemble any planet Cameron Reid had studied in xenogeography briefings. From orbit, it shimmered like a pearl suspended in violet mist, its continents threaded with luminous rivers that pulsed faintly at night, as though the world itself possessed a circulatory system. The diplomatic districts were arranged in vast concentric arcs, each embassy complex built to suit the gravity, atmosphere, and aesthetic preferences of its inhabitants. Some towers curved like frozen flames. Others floated gently above the surface, tethered by beams of coherent light. The entire planet functioned less like a capital and more like an agreement made visible. Cameron had been on Covenant Prime for 11 months, 3 weeks, and 4 days. He kept track because routine helped him feel anchored in a place where even the air composition subtly adjusted itself by district. Officially, he served as a senior medical technician attached to the Interstellar Cooperative Health Initiative. Unofficially, he was the man people called when an alien diplomat's immune system decided that gravity was a personal insult. He liked his work. Cells made sense. Proteins obeyed chemical logic. Even alien physiology, once stripped of its exotic presentation, followed patterns. There was comfort in that. When he first arrived, he had been overwhelmed by the variety. Silicon-based vascular fluids, bioluminescent nerve clusters, exoskeletal lymph matrices. But eventually the unfamiliar became fascinating rather than frightening. He had long ago decided that if the universe insisted on being strange, he might as well get good at measuring it. The medical complex where he worked was built of translucent crystal that refracted the twin suns into shifting rainbows across the polished floors. Diagnostic pods lined the central hall, each one equipped with adaptive nanoscanners capable of reading genetic sequences down to quantum-level variations. The equipment was Covenant Prime's pride, biosymphonic analyzers that translated DNA into harmonic data streams, allowing physicians to hear anomalies as discordant notes. Cameron did not hear music when he looked at a genome. He saw numbers, long strings of them. Still, he respected the poetry of the system. That morning, he stood beside a diagnostic console while a four-armed delegate from the Valori cluster complained that the scanner's hum was off by half a tone. Cameron adjusted the frequency modulator and offered a sympathetic nod. "If it helps," he said, "my species can't hear half the tones in this building. For all I know, the walls are singing about us." The Valori delegate paused, then emitted a low vibration that the translator rendered as amusement. Crisis averted. After lunch, an unfortunate attempt at nutrient gel marketed as Earth-style lasagna, Cameron received a standard compliance notification. All off-world personnel were required to undergo updated genetic screening every 12 cycles. It was a procedural formality designed to monitor cross-species pathogen risks and adaptive mutations. He had done it before. He rolled his chair toward an empty diagnostic pod and initiated the scan himself. The interface shifted to accommodate human parameters, the crystal walls dimming as nanoscopic filaments extended like strands of silver silk. He pressed his palm against the central panel. "Routine check," he muttered. "Please don't discover I'm secretly part fungus." The scanner activated with a soft resonance. Filaments traced the surface of his skin, painless and cool. On the display, his genetic map unfolded in spiraling strands of light, each nucleotide represented as a flicker in a vast lattice. He had always found it faintly humbling, this luminous representation of everything he was, reduced to structured code. The scan lasted less than a minute. A chime signaled completion. His results were automatically encrypted and transmitted to the central archive, as required by Covenant Prime's health accords. He did not give it another thought. He had 3 post-operative calibrations scheduled, and a Karathi ambassador whose symbiotic gut flora required careful rebalancing. Far above the medical district, beyond the diplomatic rings, and into the elevated arcologies reserved for the sovereign administration, the Central Archive received his file. The archive was not merely a database. It was an ancient system, older than Covenant Prime's current political structure, built upon quantum biological processors that interfaced directly with the ruling house. Within its crystalline core, strands of genetic data were not only stored, but compared, layered against centuries of records belonging to the native species of the world. The system existed for many purposes: epidemiological modeling, evolutionary forecasting, and, most sacred of all, compatibility harmonics. When Cameron's file integrated into the lattice, a sequence alignment protocol initiated automatically. It compared his genetic architecture against the baseline matrices of the ruling lineage. At first, the process followed its usual path, cross-referencing, discarding, categorizing. Then the harmonic resonance index began to climb. In the palace's inner sanctum, a column of suspended crystal pulsed brighter. The compatibility algorithm did not often produce significant matches with off-world genomes. The statistical probability was infinitesimal. Yet as the alignment deepened, Cameron Reid's genetic strands locked into resonance with one specific royal sequence. Not partial, not moderate, perfect. The resonance threshold crossed into sacred classification. Within the palace, subtle alarms activated. Not sirens, but harmonic shifts detectable only to those attuned to the system. Court geneticists glanced toward their consoles as light intensified along the archive spire. One of them whispered, "That is not possible." The designation code materialized, sovereign match. Back in the medical complex, Cameron leaned over a hovering display, explaining to a junior technician why one should never trust a fluctuating metabolic index without recalibrating for atmospheric variance. "It's like blaming your heartbeat on the weather," he said. "Technically possible, but usually you just forgot to adjust for humidity." He did not notice the security liaison entering the hall until the man cleared his throat with diplomatic precision. The liaison wore the insignia of the royal administration, an iridescent sigil shaped like intertwined strands. "Technician Reid," the liaison said smoothly. "Her Majesty's office requests your presence for consultation." Cameron blinked. "Consultation about what?" "I promise I returned all borrowed equipment. The matter pertains to your recent genetic screening." Cameron stared at him. "If this is about elevated caffeine markers, I can explain." The liaison's expression did not change. "Transportation is prepared." As Cameron powered down his console and followed the envoy through corridors that gradually shifted from medical pragmatism to architectural grandeur, a faint unease crept beneath his humor. Genetic screening rarely warranted royal attention. Pathogen alerts went through health channels. Policy concerns went through diplomatic offices. Royal summons did not happen because someone's cholesterol was disappointing. They ascended via a gravitic lift that offered a panoramic view of Covenant Prime's luminous expanse. The twin suns dipped toward the horizon, casting amber light across floating terraces and distant spires. For a moment, Cameron forgot his anxiety and simply watched. "Am I in trouble?" he asked lightly. "That depends," the liaison replied. "On what?" "On whether you believe in destiny." Cameron snorted before he could stop himself. "I believe in peer review." The liaison did not laugh. High above, in a chamber carved from living crystal and threaded with bioluminescent veins, Queen Talene stood before the archive spire. The luminous strands reflected in her dark eyes as she studied the data projected before her. She appeared human at first glance, tall, poised, composed, but the elegant length of her ears, tapering gracefully beyond her hair, marked her lineage unmistakably. She read the designation again. Perfect biological match. For a long moment, she said nothing. Then very softly, she asked the assembled genetic council, "Who is Cameron Reid?" And far below, unaware that his life had just intersected with a sacred algorithm older than his civilization's interstellar travel, Cameron Reid followed a royal envoy toward a future he would have dismissed as statistically absurd only an hour before. The gravitic lift released Cameron into a corridor that felt less constructed and more cultivated. The walls were translucent, alive with faint currents of light that flowed like slow lightning trapped in glass. Each step forward carried him deeper into architecture that had not been designed for efficiency, but for permanence. The air was warmer here, perfumed with something subtle and mineral, like rain on heated stone. He became acutely aware that his shoes were squeaking. The royal liaison walked half a pace ahead, posture impeccable. Cameron resisted the urge to ask if there was a dress code he had violated simply by existing. He smoothed his uniform jacket anyway. They passed through an archway that opened into a vast chamber. The ceiling arced high above, disappearing into refracted sunlight. Suspended at the center of the room was a column of crystalline lattice, humming softly. Within it, strands of light intertwined, genetic sequences rendered visible, shifting in slow, deliberate spirals. Cameron stopped despite himself. "That's not decorative, is it?" "It is the sovereign archive," the liaison replied. "It contains the genetic continuity of our people." "Of course it does," Cameron murmured. "Why wouldn't it be floating and glowing?" Figures stood at the perimeter of the chamber, officials clad in layered garments that shimmered like woven starlight. At the far end, elevated slightly upon a crescent platform, stood a woman. Cameron's first impression was not of royalty, but of composure. She stood still in a way that suggested not stiffness, but control. Her features were striking yet familiar, human in structure, though refined by something subtler. The difference lay in her ears, long, elegant, tapering beyond the line of her jaw, marking her species unmistakably. They framed her face like living sigils of heritage. Her eyes were fixed on him. Cameron swallowed. "That's, probably her." The liaison inclined his head and stepped aside. "Her Majesty, Queen Talene." Cameron managed a bow that was halfway between diplomatic courtesy and uncertain yoga stretch. He straightened too quickly and nearly lost balance. A faint ripple moved through the gathered officials. Perhaps shock, perhaps restrained laughter. Talene's voice carried without strain. "Technician Cameron Reid." He nodded. "Present. And unless I misread the summons, slightly confused." A flicker passed through her eyes, something that might have been amusement, quickly restrained. "You underwent routine genetic screening today." "Yes, Your Majesty. I do that every cycle. I assume this isn't about my dietary habits." "It is not." One of the council members stepped forward, activating a projection field. The air between them filled with strands of luminous code. Cameron recognized his own genomic structure immediately. He had stared at similar renderings many times before, but interwoven with his sequence was another, longer, more complex, marked with royal insignia. Talene did not look at the projection. She watched him. "Our compatibility system," she said evenly, "has identified you as my optimal genetic match." Silence settled across the chamber. Cameron blinked once, twice. "I'm sorry," he said carefully. "Your optimal what?" "Genetic match," the counselor repeated, reverent. "The alignment index exceeds any recorded resonance in our archives." Cameron turned his attention fully to the projection. He stepped closer, instinct overriding intimidation. The sequences pulsed in harmonic synchronization, nodes lighting in coordinated patterns. "That's impressive," he admitted. "Statistically improbable, but impressive." "It is sacred," another official corrected. "Right," Cameron said quickly. "Sacred improbability." "My mistake." Talene descended from the platform with measured steps. Up close, her presence was not overwhelming, but precise, as though gravity favored her slightly. She stopped at a respectful distance. "In our culture," she said, "genetic convergence of this magnitude is binding. It indicates biological harmony for optimal offspring. Historically, such matches ensured survival during periods of planetary instability." Cameron nodded slowly. "That makes evolutionary sense. Select for resilience, reduce hereditary vulnerabilities." "You accept it easily," she observed. "I accept the data," he clarified. "I'm less certain about the implications." A murmur stirred among the council. Talene tilted her head slightly, studying him. "You do not appear honored." Cameron exhaled softly. "With respect, Your Majesty, I barely know you. My species doesn't typically treat DNA as a marriage proposal." The statement hung in the air like an unauthorized particle. One of the elders stiffened. "You question the sovereign algorithm?" "I question the leap from compatibility to destiny," Cameron replied. "They're not the same variable." Talene's gaze sharpened, not in anger but in interest. "Explain." Cameron gestured toward the projection. "This system predicts biological optimization, immune synergy, cognitive adaptability, maybe reduced genetic disorders. It doesn't measure whether we enjoy the same music or whether we argue about room temperature." A faint, unexpected sound escaped Talene. almost a laugh. She masked it quickly. Our algorithm has guided our unions for centuries, she said. It preserved us when our population fell below sustainable thresholds. I respect that, Cameron answered, but your species is no longer on the brink of extinction. The chamber grew still. Talene's eyes flicked briefly to the glowing archive, then back to him. You suggest the system is obsolete. I suggest, he said carefully, that survival and fulfillment are not identical objectives. One of the counselors stepped forward sharply. The designation has already been transmitted to the High Assembly. The people will expect acknowledgement. Cameron stared at him. You announce this? It is a matter of continuity. He turned to Talene, incredulous. Does anyone ask the human before declaring him biologically significant? Talene held his gaze. You stand before me now. That's not exactly the same as consent, he muttered. A few officials shifted uncomfortably. Talene regarded him in silence. Her expression did not harden, yet something behind it deepened. You fear losing autonomy. I fear being reduced to a data set, Cameron replied. I left Earth to practice medicine, not to fulfill a prophecy. The word prophecy rippled through the chamber with faint disapproval. Talene's ears angled slightly backward, a subtle movement that Cameron instinctively recognized as tension. Our people do not use the term prophecy. We use probability. Probability still allows choice, he countered. For a long moment, neither spoke. The projection between them shifted automatically, zooming into a region where their genetic strands aligned in intricate symmetry. It was undeniably extraordinary. Cameron felt the pull of curiosity, scientific fascination overriding discomfort. May I? He asked, stepping closer to the interface. Talene gestured permission. He adjusted the parameters, isolating the resonance index. Lines of statistical modeling cascaded across the display. You see this? He said, pointing. The algorithm predicts enhanced hybrid viability, strong adaptive traits. That's remarkable, but it doesn't quantify emotional variables. It can't. Our studies show correlation between high resonance and long-term relational stability, a counselor interjected. Correlation, Cameron repeated gently, is not causation. Talene watched him manipulate the data with steady hands. There was no arrogance in his movements, only fluency. You do not reject the possibility, she observed quietly. Cameron paused. I reject inevitability. Her eyes held his. The tension in the chamber thickened again, but this time it felt less like accusation and more like uncertainty. Talene straightened slightly. Technician Reid, our people will interpret this designation as sacred. If we dismiss it outright, we destabilize centuries of tradition. If we accept it without question, we surrender to code. Cameron gave a small, helpless shrug. Welcome to modern science. A corner of her mouth curved despite herself. You are irreverent, she said. I cope with existential pressure through humor, he replied. It's either that or panic. Another faint ripple of restrained reaction moved through the officials. Talene turned her gaze briefly toward the assembled council. Leave us. There was hesitation, visible, collective, but obedience prevailed. One by one, the officials withdrew, the chamber gradually emptying until only the hum of the archive remained. Cameron became acutely aware that he stood alone with a queen whose genome apparently wanted to cooperate with his. Talene stepped closer, though still maintaining distance. Without the audience, her posture softened almost imperceptibly. Tell me honestly, she said, voice lower now, stripped of ceremonial resonance. If your world possessed such a system, would you trust it? Cameron considered the question carefully. I'd analyze it, he said at last. I'd test its margins of error. I'd look for bias in the modeling. And if it proves statistically flawless, then I'd treat it as excellent advice, he replied, not a command. Talene studied his face as though searching for deception and finding none. You are not what I expected, she admitted. He offered a tentative smile. I imagine you were hoping for someone taller, or at least royal. I was expecting someone who would kneel and declare destiny fulfilled. Cameron glanced at the glowing archive. I prefer informed consent fulfilled. For a heartbeat, silence lingered. Then Talene did something unexpected. She smiled fully, brief, unguarded. It appears, she said, that the algorithm selected not obedience, but complication. Cameron exhaled slowly. Story of my life. Above them, the luminous strands of DNA continued their synchronized dance, humming softly in harmonic alignment, perfect in structure, uncertain in meaning. By the time Cameron was escorted back to the medical district, Covenant Prime already knew, not in full detail, not in quiet nuance, but in fragments, whispers moving through diplomatic channels, coded pulses across secure networks, ceremonial phrases exchanged in markets and sky bridges. The Sovereign Archive had issued a designation. The Queen had a match, and the match was human. Cameron learned this when 3 different patients looked at him with a mixture of awe and poorly concealed curiosity. The Valori delegate from the previous day flexed all 4 hands and asked, "Is it true that you have been harmonized?" "I've been what?" Cameron replied, adjusting a metabolic stabilizer. "Harmonized. With the Sovereign." Cameron sighed. "I had a meeting. It did not include background music." The delegate's translator buzzed in confusion. Later that afternoon, a junior technician approached him as though nearing a radioactive isotope. "Sir," she whispered, "are you going to be relocated?" "Relocated?" he echoed. "I just unpacked." "To the palace." "I work with digestive anomalies," he said dryly. "I doubt that qualifies as royal preparation." But the stares persisted. Covenant Prime thrived on equilibrium, and the idea that an off-world medical technician had been woven into the genetic destiny of its monarch disrupted that equilibrium in subtle ways. He tried to focus on his work. Cells still divided, pathogens still mutated. A Karathi ambassador's symbiotic bacteria still required delicate recalibration. Science, at least, remained indifferent to romantic speculation. It was near evening when a discreet chime sounded at his console. A private channel request. Origin, Royal Administration. Cameron closed his eyes briefly. "Of course it is," he accepted. Talene's image materialized in holographic clarity above the interface. Without the ceremonial chamber behind her, she appeared in a quieter setting, an office or study carved from pale crystal, strands of faint bioluminescence tracing the walls. Her long ears were unadorned, her attire less formal, though still unmistakably regal. "You look busy," she observed. "I was stabilizing alien gut flora," he replied. "It's a glamorous life." "I have interrupted something important. Only the digestive future of an ambassadorial alliance." A pause. "Should I call back?" He leaned back slightly. "No, I assume this isn't about probiotics." Her lips curved faintly. "It is about fallout." "Ah!" She deactivated the projection's background filters. Outside the crystalline walls behind her, Cameron could see distant city lights flickering beneath the twin suns' descent. "The Assembly has begun debate," she said. "Traditionalists insist we formalize the bond immediately. Reformists argue that the archive overstepped." "And you?" he asked. Her gaze held steady through the projection field. "I have delayed public declaration." "That seems wise," he said. "Announcing interstellar marriage before coffee rarely ends well." She ignored the joke, though a flicker in her eyes suggested she registered it. "My people consider genetic convergence sacred. To question it publicly is to question our ancestors." "And to obey it blindly," he asked gently, "is to surrender sovereignty to code." Silence hovered between them. He found himself studying her face more carefully this time. The way the ambient light traced her features. The subtle movement of her ears when she listened. Tilting forward slightly, attuned. "You don't seem like someone who enjoys surrendering sovereignty," he said. "I do not," she answered evenly. "Then why hesitate?" "Because leadership is not only personal conviction," she replied. "It is collective trust." He nodded slowly. "On Earth, we argue about algorithms all the time. Predictive policing, genetic risk scoring, even romantic matching services." "Romantic matching services?" "Applications that suggest partners based on data patterns." Her brow lifted slightly. "You entrust intimate bonds to machines?" "Some people do. The success rate is variable. Yet you continue to use them." We also continue to eat questionable street food. Humanity is resilient. A faint sound escaped her, closer to a laugh than anything he had heard before. The projection shimmered briefly as encrypted notifications scrolled across the side of his console. Public sentiment metrics. News feeds. "You are trending," she said. "That sounds unhealthy. Your name is circulating across civic networks. Speculation is escalating. About my charming personality, I assume. About whether you will accept your role." He straightened slightly. "Role implies script. In this case," she said, "it implies consort." He blinked. That escalated quickly. "You are not frightened," she observed. "I'm terrified," he corrected calmly. "I just hide it behind sarcasm." Her gaze softened. "There is another complication," she continued. "A faction within the assembly believes your genetic alignment indicates divine selection." Cameron pressed his fingers to his forehead. "Please tell me that's a metaphor." "It is not. I am a medical technician," he said slowly. "The closest I come to divinity is adjusting someone's sodium levels. They argue that the archive cannot err. And if it did," he asked, "then centuries of faith unravel." The weight of that settled heavily. Cameron leaned forward, elbows on his knees. "What do you want, Talene?" He used her name without thinking. There was a brief stillness, an acknowledgement of informality, crossing a boundary. "I want clarity," she said at last. "I want to know whether what I feel in this moment is curiosity or conditioning." "You feel something?" Her ears angled back slightly. "Do not overinterpret." He raised both hands. "I wouldn't dare." A subtle pulse ran through the hologram as external interference brushed the channel. "I have authorized you limited access to the archive's compatibility modeling," she said, "under supervision. You're letting me audit the sacred algorithm? I am allowing you to examine the science beneath it." He stared at her. "You trust me that much?" "I trust that you value data over mythology." "That's fair. And," she added quietly, "I trust that you will not exploit this for personal advantage." He considered that. "If I intended to exploit it, I'd at least negotiate a better office." That time she did laugh. Soft, unguarded. The sound lingered between them longer than the joke required. "There is something else," she said, tone shifting again. "Some among my council question your suitability." "I'm sure they do. They argue that your profession lacks strategic value." He frowned slightly. "Healing people lacks strategic value? In a military context, no. In symbolic context, they expected a warrior or a statesman." "I calibrate scanners," he said mildly. "It's a tragic disappointment." Her gaze sharpened. "You underestimate yourself." "Occupational hazard." She studied him through the projection field as though reassessing variables. "Tomorrow," she said, "I will visit the medical district." Cameron froze. "You are coming here?" "Yes." "With guards?" "Discreetly." He glanced around at the cluttered diagnostic stations behind him. "I should probably clean." "You are uncomfortable." "I'm imagining the Valori delegate fainting when the Queen walks into triage." "That may be educational," she replied. He shook his head slowly, half incredulous. "You realize this will intensify speculation?" "It will also allow me to observe you in your natural environment." He narrowed his eyes. "Am I being studied?" "Yes." "Comforting." She stepped slightly closer to the projection field, her image enlarging fractionally. "The archive selected you," she said quietly, "but I choose to understand you." The words landed differently. Cameron held her gaze. "Then understand this," he said. "I won't be claimed by biology, but I won't dismiss possibility either." A faint hum from the archive echoed distantly through the connection, as though the system itself registered the exchange. Talene inclined her head once. "Tomorrow, then." The projection dissolved. Cameron remained seated for a long moment, staring at the empty space where she had stood. Around him, the medical complex resumed its quiet rhythm, machines humming, data streaming, distant footsteps echoing against crystal floors. He looked down at his hands, same genome, and yet somewhere in the luminous heart of Covenant Prime, an ancient system had declared those hands compatible with a queen. He exhaled slowly. "Tomorrow," he muttered to himself, "try not to trip in front of royalty." The diagnostic pods continued their soft harmonic resonance, unaware that within their measured precision, something far less quantifiable had begun to unfold. The medical district had never been quiet, but that morning it vibrated with a different frequency. Cameron arrived 2 hours early, which he told himself was due to professional diligence, and not the fact that a planetary monarch intended to walk through triage. He adjusted diagnostic pods that did not require adjustment, recalibrated scanners that had calibrated themselves overnight, and reorganized a supply shelf so thoroughly that even the nanobots seemed confused. "Why are you polishing the sterilization unit?" his junior technician asked. "Because," Cameron replied gravely, "if I'm going to become a constitutional crisis, I'd prefer to do so in a clean environment." She stared at him. "She's really coming?" "So I've been told. Try not to bow to the defibrillator." Rumors had rippled through the district despite Talene's promise of discretion. Security presence increased, not overtly, but enough that one noticed unfamiliar figures positioned with calculated casualness. The air felt charged like the moment before a plasma storm. At precisely midday, the outer doors parted. Talene entered without fanfare. She wore no crown, no ceremonial mantle, only a streamlined garment of deep blue fabric interwoven with faint threads of light that responded subtly to her movements. Her long ears were unadorned, catching the ambient glow as she stepped inside. Two guards followed at a respectful distance, their presence unmistakable yet unobtrusive. Conversations halted. Equipment hummed louder in the sudden stillness. Cameron resisted the urge to salute a centrifuge. Talene's gaze moved across the chamber with measured curiosity. This was not the crystalline sanctum of the palace. Here the floors bore faint scuffs from transport carts. The air carried the sterile tang of disinfectant layered over alien pheromones. Life here was functional, imperfect. She approached him. "Technician Reid," she said evenly. "Your Majesty," he replied, inclining his head with greater stability than during their first meeting. "Welcome to organized chaos." Her eyes drifted to a nearby diagnostic pod where a multi-limbed patient lay beneath adaptive scanners. "You treat multiple species in a single facility," she observed. "We try not to mix up the blood samples," he said. "It complicates diplomacy." A faint curve touched her mouth. He gestured toward the central console. "Would you like a tour? I promise the equipment bites only occasionally." "I would," she said. They moved together through the district. Cameron explained how the nanoscopic filaments adjusted to different molecular densities, how the biosymphonic analyzers translated genomic sequences into harmonic patterns. Talene listened closely, occasionally asking questions that revealed familiarity with advanced genetic theory. "You studied this?" he asked at one point. "I was educated in the sciences before I was crowned," she replied. "Leadership without comprehension invites dependency." "That's refreshingly rational," he said. "On my world, politicians sometimes struggle with basic statistics." "I have observed your broadcasts," she said mildly. He winced. "Please forget those." They paused beside a holographic display projecting a Karathi immune response model. The swirling strands of light resembled miniature nebulae. Talene extended her hand, fingers hovering just above the projection field. "Your work stabilizes alliances." "It stabilizes organisms," he corrected gently. "Alliances are a side effect." She studied the shifting model. "You do not seek recognition." "I seek reduced mortality rates," he said. "Recognition is harder to calibrate." A small commotion stirred near the entrance as a Valori delegate, clearly overwhelmed by royal proximity, attempted an elaborate bow and collided lightly with a supply cart. Cameron closed his eyes briefly. "Perfect," he muttered. "Exactly the subtle atmosphere I was aiming for." Talene's composure flickered again, amusement threading through it. "Your presence here appears to generate equal instability." "Occupational hazard," he replied. They moved toward a quieter alcove where the noise of the main chamber softened. "Public reaction intensifies," she said without preamble. "The assembly demands clarity." "And have you provided any?" he asked. "I have stated that evaluation continues." He nodded. "Good. Evaluation is underrated." Her gaze fixed on him more intently. "There are those who believe your reluctance insults our tradition." "I don't intend insult," he said carefully. "I intend accuracy." She folded her hands behind her back. If the archive had identified a member of your species as a compatible ruler for your planet, would you accept? He considered the question. No. Her brow lifted slightly. I would ask how the algorithm defined compatibility, he continued. Survival metrics? Cultural adaptability? Psychological alignment? I'd ask whether it accounted for free will. Free will, she repeated softly. You've built a civilization advanced enough to terraform moons and manipulate quantum genomes, he said. It seems inconsistent to surrender personal choice to a statistical model. Her ears angled forward slightly, attentive. Our ancestors faced extinction. The archive prevented genetic collapse. And that was necessary, he agreed. But necessity evolves. She looked past him toward the patients, the technicians, the flowing data streams. If I reject the designation outright, I fracture faith. If I accept it without question, I fracture autonomy. Then don't do either, he said. Her eyes returned to his. Elaborate. Treat it as hypothesis, he suggested, not conclusion. Silence stretched between them, thoughtful rather than tense. You propose we test destiny, she said. I propose we test compatibility beyond chromosomes, he replied. Spend time together. Debate. Annoy each other. See if the probability holds up in reality. And if it does not, then the archive remains valuable for health forecasting, he said lightly, and we avoid an awkward wedding. That earned a clearer laugh from her, quickly subdued as a pair of officials passed within earshot. You approach this as experiment, she said. I approach everything as experiment. She studied him for a long moment. There is courage in that. There's also stubbornness, he admitted. A notification chimed softly at her wrist interface. Her expression shifted slightly as she reviewed it. Opposition factions are organizing demonstrations, she said. They accuse the archive of corruption. Because it chose a human? Yes. Cameron exhaled slowly. Then this isn't just about us. It never was. He leaned against a console, lowering his voice. Talene, if I become symbol before I become person, this will collapse. Her gaze sharpened at the use of her name again, though she did not correct him. I do not intend to reduce you to symbol, she said quietly. Good, he replied, because I'm terrible at representing anything larger than a spreadsheet. She stepped closer, still proper distance, but near enough that he could see faint patterns of light reflected in her irises from the overhead panels. When the archive signaled, she said softly, I felt displaced. Displaced? As though something deeply personal had been decided without my participation. He nodded slowly. I felt something similar. The hum of the medical district continued around them, steady and indifferent. I will convene a private review council, she said at last. You will present your analysis of the algorithm. You want me to stand in front of your genetic clergy and critique their sacred system? Yes, he inhaled. I should update my will. Her lips curved faintly. You are not in danger. Historically, challenging sacred systems ends unpredictably. Our people are not primitive. Neither are mine, he said. We still argue about vaccines. She shook her head slightly, half exasperated, half amused. Very well, he said after a moment. I'll prepare a presentation, with graphs. Graphs? She echoed. Nothing undermines mysticism like a well-labeled axis. Her laughter came again, softer this time. Around them, the medical district resumed its rhythm. Patients attended, scanners calibrated. Yet beneath the ordinary motion, something more complex was unfolding. An intersection not merely of genomes, but of ideologies. As Talene turned to depart, she paused. One more question, she said. Dangerous words, he replied. If the archive had not selected you, would you still stand here debating me? He considered that honestly. Yes, he said, because I respect your mind. For a heartbeat, the air seemed to shift. Then she inclined her head slightly and stepped back. Composure restored. We will test your hypothesis, she said. Not destiny. He watched as she crossed the chamber, guards falling into step behind her. The doors parted once more, and the Queen of Covenant Prime exited the medical district, leaving behind a hum of machines and a technician who had just volunteered to argue with tradition. Cameron looked around at the familiar crystal walls, the glowing diagnostic pods, the quietly breathing patients. Well, he muttered to himself, no pressure. Above the city, beyond the visible skyline, the sovereign archive continued its harmonic resonance, luminous strands intertwined in flawless symmetry, unaware that two of the variables it had aligned were now preparing to test whether science predicted love or merely suggested the possibility of it. The private review council convened beneath the sovereign archive itself. Cameron decided this was either an honor or a tactical intimidation strategy. The chamber was smaller than the public hall, yet more intense in atmosphere. The crystalline column that housed the genetic lattice rose through the center of the room, its inner strands of light flowing in deliberate spirals. Every few seconds, a harmonic pulse moved through it, like a slow heartbeat. Around the perimeter stood 12 council members, geneticists, ethicists, historians, each representing a different branch of Covenant Prime's intellectual tradition. Talene stood at the head of the chamber, not elevated this time, but level with the others. Cameron adjusted the projection module clipped to his wrist and whispered to himself, "All right, don't accidentally dismantle a civilization." One of the elder counselors regarded him with composed skepticism. "Technician Reid, you have requested access to the archive's raw compatibility model." "I have," Cameron replied, "and I appreciate the trust." "Trust," another counselor echoed faintly, as if testing the word for structural weakness. Talene's gaze flicked briefly toward him, steady, unreadable. Cameron activated his projection field, the air filled with layered strands of luminous code, his genome, Talene's, and the calculated overlap between them. He expanded the resonance matrix until it hovered three-dimensional and complex, a lattice of intersecting probabilities. "As you know," he began, "the sovereign algorithm measures genomic compatibility across multiple axes, immune resilience, neural plasticity, metabolic synchronization, and reproductive viability." Murmurs of agreement. "What it does exceptionally well," he continued, "is optimize biological outcomes." A senior geneticist inclined her head. "It was designed for that purpose." "Yes," Cameron said, "during periods of population collapse." The harmonic pulse within the archive brightened faintly, as if reacting to its own history being invoked. He adjusted the display, isolating a probability curve that arced elegantly through the projection. "This curve predicts hybrid offspring stability at 99.8%, he said. "Extraordinary. Almost unprecedented." "It is not almost," the geneticist corrected. "It is unprecedented." "Fair enough, Mr. Rome," Cameron conceded. "From a biological standpoint, this match is remarkable." One of the ethicists folded his hands. "Then your resistance is illogical." Cameron suppressed a sigh. "My resistance is contextual." He expanded the projection again, overlaying a second data model. Psychosocial variability indices drawn from interspecies alliance studies. "The algorithm does not measure emotional compatibility," he said. "It does not quantify shared values, communication styles, conflict resolution tendencies." "Such variables are unpredictable," the ethicist replied. "Exactly," Cameron said gently. "Unpredictable does not mean irrelevant." A faint tension rippled through the chamber. Talene watched him without interruption. The elder counselor spoke again. "Our ancestors entrusted survival to the system. You question its authority." "I question its scope," Cameron corrected. He rotated the model, highlighting areas of near-perfect resonance. "Biology suggests potential," he said. "It does not mandate outcome." One of the historians stepped forward slightly. "In past centuries, high-resonance unions correlated with stable governance." "Correlation," Cameron said carefully, "is not causation." A subtle stir moved through the group at his repetition of the phrase. Talene's lips curved almost imperceptibly. Cameron continued. "May I demonstrate something?" He tapped his interface, introducing a controlled perturbation into the projection. The harmonic strands flickered, recalculating. "This is a simulation of environmental stress, political unrest, resource scarcity, external threat," he explained. "The model adjusts for genetic adaptability, not emotional strain." He introduced another variable, ideological divergence. The projection wavered slightly. "Notice," he said, The stability of offspring remains high, but relational durability is not modeled. The geneticist frowned. Relational durability is not quantifiable. It is, Cameron replied. Imperfectly, but it is. Communication patterns, psychological compatibility markers, these can be studied. You suggest expanding the archive? The ethicist asked. I suggest reframing it, Cameron said, from decree to advisory. The word decree hung heavy in the air. The elder counselor's gaze sharpened. You are aware that many citizens already interpret this designation as sacred destiny. Yes, Cameron said quietly, and that concerns me. Because you fear responsibility? Because I fear misinterpretation, he answered. Silence followed. Talene stepped forward at last. Our people survive by trusting the archive, she said, but survival is no longer our only objective. Her voice carried not as proclamation, but as measured reflection. Cameron glanced at her, surprised by the openness in her tone. The geneticist folded her hands. Your Majesty, the archive has never erred in biological optimization. No one disputes that, Cameron said quickly. I am not accusing it of malfunction. Then what are you accusing, the ethicist pressed. Of being incomplete, he replied. The harmonic pulse within the crystalline column brightened again, strands of light intertwining more intensely as if the system sensed scrutiny. One of the younger council members spoke hesitantly. If we reduce the designation to advisory status, we undermine centuries of reverence. Talene turned to him. Reverence must evolve. Cameron resisted the urge to look visibly relieved. He shifted the projection once more, this time isolating the resonance index between his genome and Talene's. It glowed brilliant and undeniable. I won't pretend this isn't extraordinary, he said. From a scientific perspective, I'm fascinated. From a personal perspective, I'm overwhelmed. A faint murmur. He met their eyes steadily. If I accept this match because your algorithm says I should, I surrender my autonomy. If I reject it out of fear, I ignore possibility. The elder counselor studied him. What do you propose? Time, Cameron said simply. The word echoed softly against crystal walls. Time to evaluate compatibility beyond chromosomes, he continued. Time to determine whether shared biology translates into shared intention. The ethicist considered this. You would conduct a trial courtship? Cameron blinked. When you phrase it like that, it sounds medieval. It is ancient, the historian corrected. Talene's gaze remained on Cameron. You are willing? He hesitated only briefly. I am willing to explore, not to surrender. The chamber fell quiet again, not with hostility, but with thought. Outside the crystalline walls, distant city lights shimmered under the fading suns. Covenant Prime continued its complex rhythm, trade negotiations, scientific research, cultural exchange, all unaware that within this chamber, tradition and autonomy were being renegotiated. The geneticist finally inclined her head. If the sovereign consents to advisory interpretation, the archive will not oppose. Cameron stared at the crystalline column. It can oppose? It can signal priority, she replied. Talene turned toward the luminous lattice. Archive, she said calmly. Adjust designation status. Sovereign match reclassified as advisory convergence. For a moment, nothing happened. Then the harmonic pulse shifted. The strands of light did not dim, nor did they fracture. Instead, their resonance softened slightly, no longer blaring like ceremonial trumpets, but humming with steady potential. A collective breath seemed to release in the chamber. Cameron exhaled slowly. Well, he murmured, that didn't trigger planetary collapse. Not yet, the elder counselor said dryly. Talene allowed the faintest smile. The ethicist folded his hands. The public will demand explanation. They will receive one, Talene said evenly. And if unrest escalates? Then we address it, she replied. Cameron glanced between them. If it helps, I'm very non-threatening. A faint ripple of restrained amusement passed through the younger council members. Talene stepped closer to him, voice low enough that only he could hear. You have altered a sacred classification. You authorized it, he reminded her. I did. Regretting it? Her long ears angled forward slightly, thoughtful rather than defensive. No. The harmonic hum of the archive settled into a calmer rhythm. For the first time since the designation had appeared, the air in the chamber felt less charged with inevitability and more alive with choice. Cameron deactivated his projection, the luminous strands dissolving into the ambient glow. "So," he said lightly, "does this mean I'm not immediately betrothed?" Talene's eyes held his, steady and intent. "It means," she replied, "that we will discover whether biology predicted love or merely suggested the possibility of it." Cameron swallowed, then nodded once. "Possibility," he said. "I can work with that." Above them, within the crystalline core of Covenant Prime, the sovereign archive continued its luminous dance, not issuing commands, not enforcing destiny, but quietly recalculating what it meant to harmonize survival with choice. The reclassification of the sovereign match did not calm Covenant Prime. It rearranged it. Within hours of Talene's announcement, civic networks ignited with debate. Public forums filled with projections of the archive's glowing strands, dissected by commentators who alternated between reverence and outrage. Some hailed the Queen's decision as enlightened evolution. Others declared it a fracture in sacred continuity. Cameron discovered he had become a variable in political theory. He was in the medical district adjusting a neural interface for a patient with tri-lobed cortex architecture when the lights flickered. Not dimmed, flickered. Every diagnostic panel along the wall shimmered briefly, their harmonic tones slipping half a note off key. The patient looked alarmed. "That's new," Cameron muttered. An emergency notification flashed across his console. "Archive desynchronization event. Sector 3. He frowned. The archive did not desynchronize. Across the city, the crystalline spire that housed the genetic lattice pulsed erratically, its luminous strands wavering like unstable constellations. In the palace, Talene stood before the central projection as technicians scrambled to isolate the disturbance. "It is not a system failure," one of the geneticists reported. "It is external interference." "From where?" Talene demanded. "Within our own network." Cameron's communicator activated. "Technician Reid," came the urgent voice of the royal liaison. "You are requested immediately." "I was hoping for a quieter afternoon," Cameron replied, already stripping off his gloves. By the time he reached the palace, the atmosphere had shifted from philosophical tension to technical crisis. The sovereign archive's harmonic pulse was unstable, resonance spikes flaring unpredictably through its lattice. Talene stood near the base of the crystalline column, her composure intact but her focus razor-sharp. "What happened?" Cameron asked as he approached. "A faction within the assembly has attempted to recalibrate the compatibility index," she said. "They are trying to prove your designation was corrupted." "By hacking sacred destiny?" he asked. "They believe if they demonstrate algorithmic vulnerability, they can restore traditional authority under stricter control." Cameron stepped toward a secondary console, scanning the data streams. Lines of code flickered with unauthorized overrides, quantum subroutines looping through forced resonance simulations. "They're injecting synthetic harmonics," he said, "trying to replicate the match artificially." "Can they?" Talene asked. "No," he replied, "but they can destabilize the lattice if they push hard enough." The crystalline strands within the archive flared bright, then dimmed abruptly. Talene's ears angled back, tension evident. "If the lattice fractures—" "It won't," Cameron interrupted, more confidently than he felt. He activated his wrist module, interfacing with the secondary processors Talene had granted him access to. Layers of genomic data cascaded before him, luminous threads twisting in complex geometry. "Whoever's doing this understands the surface architecture," he muttered, "but not the deeper harmonic structure." He introduced a stabilizing algorithm, an adaptive dampening field based on medical biofeedback models he used to regulate immune storms. "You're applying hospital protocols to the archive?" Talene asked. "Cells and civilizations both hate shock," he said. The destabilization pulses began to slow, though rogue harmonics still flared intermittently. "Source located," a technician called. "Assembly chamber node." Talene's gaze hardened. "Seal the node. Revoke administrative privileges." Orders flowed through the palace with crisp efficiency. Cameron continued adjusting the dampening matrix. "They're trying to prove I forced the match," he said lightly. "Which is flattering." I didn't realize I had that level of ambition. Talene glanced at him despite the crisis. You do not. Good, he replied. Too much paperwork. A surge rippled through the lattice, sharper than the others. Cameron's console flashed warning red. They've triggered a recursive resonance, he said. If it cascades, the lattice will amplify false matches across the database, Talene finished. Exactly. And then half your population thinks they're fated to marry their dentist. Her lips twitched despite herself. Can you isolate the recursion? She asked. Working on it. He overlaid a diagnostic grid across the projection, identifying the artificial resonance nodes. They glowed slightly off-spectrum, lacking the organic fluctuation of true genomic harmonics. There, he said, pointing. Synthetic signal. It's too clean. Talene stepped closer to observe. Our algorithm has natural variance. Because biology is messy, Cameron said. That's its charm. He initiated a counter sequence, introducing controlled noise into the lattice, microscopic variations that destabilize the synthetic harmonics without affecting authentic matches. The crystalline column shuddered once, then steadied. The erratic flares subsided. A collective breath seemed to release across the chamber. Node sealed, a technician confirmed. Interference neutralized. The luminous strands of the archive returned to their steady, intricate dance. Talene exhaled slowly. Cameron leaned back from the console. Well, that was invigorating. You risked further destabilization, one of the geneticists said, voice edged with lingering alarm. I applied immunological principles, Cameron replied. Your archive experienced an autoimmune event. I calmed it down. Talene turned toward the council members who had gathered in the chamber. Identify those responsible, she ordered, but no arrests. Not yet. They attempted sabotage, one of the elders protested. They attempted control, she corrected. Out of fear. Cameron glanced at her. Fear of losing tradition. Yes, she said quietly. He stepped closer to the crystalline column, studying its restored glow. You know, he said, if your people trusted the archive completely, they wouldn't try to manipulate it. Talene regarded him thoughtfully. And if they trusted choice completely, they would not fear advisory status. Trust is inconvenient, he said. She looked at him sidelong. You are inconvenient. I'm learning that. A faint smile flickered between them. Outside the palace, news of the attempted recalibration spread rapidly. Public discourse shifted from outrage to uncertainty. The revelation that members of the assembly had interfered with the archive undermined claims of its absolute sanctity. Cameron watched the data feeds scrolling across a nearby display. They were trying to prove the system was flawless, he said. Instead, they proved it can be manipulated. Talene's gaze moved to the luminous lattice once more. No system is beyond influence, especially when politics get involved. She nodded slightly. Silence settled in the chamber, no longer tense but reflective. You stabilized the archive, she said after a moment. You authorized access, he replied. I authorized evaluation, she corrected. You defended it, he shrugged. I don't like seeing good science abused. Her eyes lingered on him. Your presence has changed more than classification status, she said. I noticed. She stepped closer, lowering her voice. They attempted to restore inevitability. And failed, he said. For now. He met her gaze steadily. Talene, if this match survives political sabotage and algorithmic interference, it won't be because of destiny. No, she agreed softly. It will be because we choose it. The harmonic hum of the archive seemed to deepen, resonant and steady. Cameron allowed himself a small, tired smile. Next time someone tries to rewrite sacred tradition, can we schedule it after lunch? Her laughter, quiet but genuine, echoed faintly against the crystal walls. Around them, the sovereign archive continued its luminous equilibrium, not dictating, not faltering, but recalibrated. And for the first time since the designation had appeared, the crisis surrounding their convergence felt less like a test of faith and more like a test of resilience. Covenant Prime had not collapsed, it had argued. For 3 cycles after the attempted interference, public forums glowed day and night. Scholars debated in suspended amphitheaters, their voices amplified by harmonic translators. Citizens projected questions directly into civic streams. The phrase advisory convergence entered common speech, sometimes with reverence, sometimes with suspicion. And through it all, the sovereign archive hummed steadily, luminous strands flowing in calm symmetry. Cameron stood once more beneath its crystalline column, though this time not as defendant or auditor, but as invited speaker. The chamber was filled, not only with council members, but with representatives from across the planet's districts. The proceedings were being broadcast openly. He adjusted the projection module on his wrist and resisted the urge to make a joke about public speaking, induced cardiac irregularities. Talene stood beside him, not elevated above the assembly, but positioned at equal height. The symbolism was deliberate. She addressed the gathering first. Our people entrusted survival to the archive, she said, her voice carrying clear and resonant. It guided us through scarcity and uncertainty. It preserved our lineage when extinction seemed inevitable. The luminous lattice brightened slightly, as if acknowledging its history. But survival, she continued, is no longer our only aim. A ripple moved through the chamber. Recently, she said, the archive identified a sovereign match beyond our species. That designation was unprecedented. It was also destabilizing. A few murmurs of agreement. We reclassified it as advisory convergence, she went on, not to diminish the archive, but to clarify its scope. She turned slightly toward Cameron. Technician Reid will explain? Cameron inhaled slowly. He activated the projection. The luminous strands of his genome and talons appeared once more, intertwined in striking harmony. This, he said, is extraordinary biology. No one argued. Your algorithm identified near-perfect genetic compatibility, enhanced immune synergy, high adaptive potential. It did exactly what it was designed to do. He shifted the projection, introducing a secondary layer, psychosocial variability indices gathered over recent cycles. But biology does not write vows, he said gently. A few faint smiles flickered across the assembly. It suggests potential, he continued. It predicts resilience. It does not command affection, trust, or shared purpose. He glanced briefly at Talene. Over the past cycles, he said, Her Majesty and I have conducted what your historians might call extended evaluation. A ripple of subdued amusement passed through the chamber. We debated governance model, he said. We disagreed about resource allocation strategies. We discovered that she prefers structured schedules, and I function better with mild chaos. Talene inclined her head slightly, conceding the point. We also discovered, Cameron continued, that compatibility in code does not eliminate difference in temperament. It simply provides a strong foundation for navigating it. He deactivated the psychosocial layer, returning the projection to pure genetic harmony. The archive remains invaluable, he said, but it is not destiny, it is data. Silence settled, contemplative rather than tense. Talene stepped forward again. We will not dismantle the archive, she said. We will not diminish its sacred history, but we will no longer interpret its designations as binding decree. The elder counselor inclined his head slowly. The archive will serve as compass, he said, echoing language from earlier debates. Not chain, Talene replied. A quiet murmur of assent flowed through the chamber. Cameron felt something loosen in his chest. After the assembly dispersed, the palace grew quieter. The public decision had been made. The advisory convergence would stand as precedent. Talene stood before a panoramic viewport overlooking Covenant Prime's luminous expanse. The twin suns dipped low, casting amber and violet across floating terraces and distant spires. You have altered our tradition, she said softly. You authorized it, Cameron replied, standing beside her. I did. She turned toward him. When the archive first signaled, I felt displaced, she admitted, as though my future had been written by code. And now, he asked. Now I feel responsible, she said, not to fulfill a designation, but to define it. He nodded slowly. I used to think genetics was predictable comfort, he said. Base pairs, probabilities, neat models. This experience has been less neat. You have grown, she observed. I've learned that data without context is dangerous, he replied, and that tradition without flexibility is brittle. A faint smile touched her lips. You no longer joke reflexively, she said. I still joke, he corrected. I just aim better. She laughed softly. Below them, the city shimmered in layered light. Civic streams had quieted. Debate had softened into discussion. The attempted sabotage had been addressed. Those responsible censured but not exiled. The crisis had exposed vulnerability, but also resilience. You are free to return fully to your medical district, Talene said after a moment. No obligation binds you. He studied her profile, the elegant line of her face, the subtle movement of her long ears in the shifting light. And you? He asked. I remain queen, she said, but not prisoner of algorithm. He considered the vastness of Covenant Prime, the luminous archive humming behind them, the improbable chain of events that had brought him here. I don't want to be your consort because a lattice glowed brightly, he said. Nor do I, she replied. I don't want to be here out of political pressure. You are not, he met her eyes. I want to be here, he said carefully, because in the middle of chaos and sabotage and philosophical crisis, you chose dialogue over decree. Her gaze held his steadily. And I want you here, she answered, because you refused to kneel to code. Silence stretched between them, warm and unforced. The harmonic hum of the archive carried faintly through the palace walls, a steady, resonant tone. Talene extended her hand, not as monarch, but as equal. Then let us test possibility, she said. Cameron looked at her hand. He took it. The gesture was simple. No ceremony, no declaration of destiny. Just contact. Human skin against alien skin, warm and real. Outside, Covenant Prime continued its luminous rhythm. The sovereign archive flowed in balanced symmetry, no longer pulsing with urgent designation, but maintaining quiet equilibrium. Later that night, Cameron returned briefly to the medical district. The Valori delegate waved all four hands enthusiastically. So, the delegate asked, are you harmonized? Cameron smiled. I'm evaluating, he replied. Back in the palace, Talene stood once more before the crystalline column. The strands of light reflected in her eyes, steady and calm. The archive had predicted extraordinary biological compatibility. It had not predicted laughter in crisis. It had not predicted stubborn debate. It had not predicted choice. Talene reached out, resting her palm lightly against the crystal surface. Not destiny, she murmured softly. Behind her, Cameron approached, hands in his pockets. Just possibility, he finished. The harmonic hum deepened slightly, not in command, not in decree, but in resonance. And on a world built upon survival, science, and sacred tradition, two individuals stood not as variables aligned by algorithm, but as partners stepping forward by choice, proving that while genetics could suggest harmony, love required something far more complex, the courage to decide.